Hello, I am Tony Kawam, Syrian-American artist and curator. I'd like to welcome you to ArtServe new exhibition entitled Emerging Art from War-Torn Syria, War and Hope, part of our Cultural Heritage September 2020 event series, the American Days for Middle Eastern Arts and Culture. We are live today from Miami with TED Talk and food writer Antonia Tahhan to discuss Middle Eastern culinary cuisine. Antonia will talk about what Syrian and Lebanese cuisine can teach us about humanity, and we'll share a recipe. Thank you.
And today, as part of our ongoing exhibit, Emerging Art from War-Torn Syria, War and Hope, we are doing a Syrian food talk with Tony Tahhan. He is a writer. He is very educated in this subject. We are very excited to hear what he has to say. And he will be joined by Tony Kwam. I'm going to bring in our guests.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining. Like Jan was saying, tonight we'll have a conversation about Syrian food. I'll be the first to say I know very little about Middle Eastern gastronomy, but I'm super excited to learn and discover this culture through its food, right? We got to discover this beautiful culture through its art and music, and now it's time to do it through its food. And here with us are two professionals on this topic. We have Tony Kawam.
Hello, everyone.
Syrian American artist and curator, and also a collaborator of ArtServe current exhibition, Emerging Art from War-Torn Syria. It's really good to have you, Tony. Good to see you.
Thank you, Sophie. Good to see you all.
Yeah, so now I'll have to welcome our guest of honor. He's a total foodie writer. He did a TED Talk on Syrian food. He was born in Venezuela to a Middle Eastern family and raised in Miami. He pursued degrees in math, economics, and Spanish literature from Cornell University, where he explored food anthropology. I'm very curious about that, and became fascinated by its stories, traditions, and taboos. In 2010, he received a Fulbright research grant to go to Syria. He's going to tell us all about that experience later. And during the COVID pandemic, he launched a web series called Teta Thursday. Am I pronouncing it right?
Yeah.
Yes.
In Arabic, grandmother.
Awesome. So this is a virtual series of conversations on food, culture, identity, where every week you interview food writers and researchers who specialize in the food of and culture of the Arab world. So we're excited to have you, Antonio Tahan. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So now I would let Tony take on.
Hello, everyone. This is Tony Kawam. I want to welcome you to this special episode here. We are honored to have Antonia Tahhan with us. And this is a subject that I believe every person in the world has interest in, regardless of age, color, origin, or language. This is something that we all share, good food and healthy food. And here's Antonio to tell us all about his experience. And I'm going to be asking him some questions, and he will, answer. And then we'll leave the Q&A until we finish our conversation. This way you have a better sense of, about the Middle Eastern, Mediterranean food, and the Syrian food and families. Antonia, thank you so much, and welcome.
Thank
Could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. First of all, I'm excited to be here. As Sophie mentioned, I was born in Venezuela. Both grandparents on both sides of my family are from Aleppo, Syria. And sometime in the 1950s, they migrated from Aleppo to Venezuela. My parents were born and raised in Venezuela. I was then born in Venezuela. So at home, we had a mix of English, Spanish, at the time, Spanish and Arabic going on. And then when I was 4, I was a little kid, we moved to Miami, my nuclear family. And so there, all 3 languages developed simultaneously, and it was a mix of cultures and identities, and food was this sort of compass that I used to sort of navigate this world. That's how I came to know my own identity, because I didn't get to visit the Middle East until I was an adult. The region was through the food and the culture and the music and the language as well.
Wonderful. What a very rich background. Who has influenced your style of cooking the most?
I would say I always grew up around food. My family was very much into cooking. In particular, though, if I had to name one person, it would be my grandmother on my mother's side, Sept. She's an avid cook. In fact, I'll get into this later on, but in Aleppo, they say Aleppans are very famous for their cuisine. And so even within Syria and the broader Arab world, Aleppan cuisine is very famous. And so I learned a lot of dishes from her. And one dish in particular, which I'll be sharing the recipe on my social media afterwards, is called rizb halib. And that's the Middle Eastern version of rice pudding.
Yes.
And in fact, we'll jump in and out. I have slides, but I don't want to. What I'll do is I have a quick photo of my grandmother and of rizb halib. So that's my grandmother, Septomuna. And this is my grandmother on my father's side. She passed away, Allah yarhamha. But that's her in Aleppo in the 1950s. She's the one all the way on the right, on my right. And then the rice pudding, what they do is they actually make them in these individual portions. But what makes the rice pudding from the Middle East special is that it's infused with rose water and orange blossom water. And so it gives it this very elegant flavor. And you have these individual cups that you serve it in, that little bowls, and it's just absolutely delicious.
Well, what inspired you to take on cooking?
Well, for me, it was, I always loved to eat. That's what my mom always told me growing up. I have 3 brothers. I was the one who was easiest to feed. I never complained. I ate everything. But it wasn't until I left home and I went to Ithaca, where I went to school, that I didn't have home cooked meals anymore. And it was a big shock, as I'm sure many college students could attest to. And for me, it was trying to figure out how to recreate those dishes. But along in that process, I invited a lot of my friends, and sort of that became a social activity within my friend group. We would get together, we would cook, and the better I got at it, the more I wanted to learn and how to really recreate those flavors that my grandmother could make. And very quickly, I realized I'll be on the phone with my grandmother and I'll ask her for a recipe for like stuffed grape leaves, the wara'anib, or yabra, as they say in Syria. That's one of my favorite dishes growing up. And she would walk with me step by step, and it would never come out the same as the way she does it. So in college, I studied, my background is in math, economics, and Spanish literature. And I always perceived food as a hobby, as something I would do for fun. And as a junior in college, my advisor, Dr. Davidis, she's Greek. And so we'd always talk academics. And then right after our meeting, our conversation would always get into food. And there was an open-ended research grant at Cornell. And I jokingly mentioned, wouldn't it be great if somebody used this grant to study food? Because we would always get into these very deep philosophical questions about how food developed. And so then that's when she told me that there's an entire field called anthropology of food. My mind was blown. I took a course. There was a professor at Cornell who taught a course called on anthropology of food, and that's what led me to go to Syria for the very first time as an adult. I was a senior in college by then, and I fell in love. I there's no other way to explain it, because another like very shocking realization for me personally, even though I grew up immersed in Syrian culture, because I was living outside of Syria, I had co-opted a lot of the unfortunate, like sometimes stereotypes that persist around the Arab world,
Yes.
without even knowing it. You know, the Arab world was a very distant place, a place of a lot of violence, a place of a lot of bloodshed. And I didn't realize that was the message I was learning. And so when I went to Syria for the first time, I was blown away how different it was than anything I had ever imagined. The very first night I got there, I met for the very first time my grandmother's sister. And it was about 1 a.m. by the time I made it to her house in Aleppo. And when I went in, there was an entire feast of small plates. And that's a very typical way of eating. I don't know if there are any folks from the Middle East tuning in, but if they're not, the style of eating of small plates is called meze.
Yes.
And so it's like small plates of hummus. We all know hummus,
Yes.
right? There's lebne, which is the strained yogurt. There's hammara, which is a famous Aleppo dish of red peppers, walnuts, and pomegranate molasses. And you turn it into a delicious dip. And all this is spread out at 1 a.m. And that's when I realized this is going to be an amazing experience. And from there, my passion just grew. What I'll do is I'll post a lot of this content on my social media, and you can tune in from there and see the small plates. But these are the grape leaves that I was talking about earlier, and you can see in the background is another plate of food. There's always at least 10 plates, 10 different small dishes that people enjoy during a Middle Eastern feast.
Sounds great. Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your favorite dish to eat, and what is your favorite dish to cook? What are some dishes you have made that your friends or guests thought were amazing?
Yeah, I think growing up, every special occasion in my family, and I'm sure many Arab families could attest to this, there always had to be a big pot of stuffed grape leaves. That, if I did well in school or if my mom asked me what I wanted to eat, that's always my go-to dish. It's very time intensive to make because you have to roll each little grape leaf by itself, and it's stuffed with a fragrant mix of rice and either ground lamb or ground beef. And it's cooked in this delicious broth, lemony broth. So there's a lot of citrus, and it's absolutely delicious. But that's my favorite dish to eat. Lately, my favorite dish to make, and this is because I've been digging into the history of this particular dish, is called haytaliye.
Yeah.
Now, haytaliye, have you had it, Tony?
Yes, yes.
By saying I grew up eating haytaliye in Miami. My family in Venezuela makes haytaliye. And without me realizing, the haytaliye is always served in these blue porcelain bowls, just like this. And I never understood why as a kid, and I never questioned it. It was delicious. It's a dessert made up of silky milk cubes. Now, we think of molecular gastronomy as being something very new, whereas this is a technique that is very ancient. In Syria, what they did was they boil milk and they thicken it with, now they use cornstarch. Traditionally, they used wheat starch. And then what they do is they thicken it very much into almost like a gel. You pour it into a casserole dish, and then immediately after you get ice cold water, and then you shock the entire system, the entire gel. And what happens is that sort of loose gel, that's sort of the consistency of like maybe icing, it turns into a silky, smooth consistency similar to silky tofu, not like the regular tofu, the very silky one. So you cut it into cubes and then you serve it with a rose ice cream, and then you finish it off with a sauce, a milk sauce made with orange blossom water. Now that I've got your mouth watering, I will share a photo of this dessert.
This is delicious. It's again, this is a dessert. It's not just for the morning. It's actually after every meal, especially when families get together or people go out, after lunch or dinner. They go especially to places in Aleppo, I remember. And of course, they sell them all over Syria and Lebanon, not just Aleppo. And people go just for a dessert, and they go for Haitalia.
Yeah. So what I learned later when I started doing research is that it made its way to Aleppo from Asia along the Silk Road. Now, not many people know this because a lot of the news of Aleppo today is obviously one of war and destruction, which is incredibly heartbreaking. But historically, Aleppo was the hub of 3 continents. It linked east and west along the Silk Road. And one of the distinguishing features that makes Aleppan cuisine so amazing is that Aleppo is the home to many communities. It has Armenians and Assyrians. It has a large, vibrant Jewish community historically, Kurdish, Muslim, Christian. All these different communities claimed Aleppo as part of their shared identity. And when a lot of people ask me, why do you focus on Aleppo? Part of the reason for that is because it was very distinguished geographically in the region. It was a major economic city. And so it brought in people from all over the world at the time, which was centered around, like it had travelers from Asia coming westward, and it had Europeans coming eastward.
That actually fantastic historical background about Aleppo, and I'd like to add to this. Aleppo is the oldest city in the world. So it's been, it's a lot of areas in Aleppo are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And Aleppo, again, because of the ancient civilizations and the Silk Road, and this Aleppo people, or the region, the entire Middle East, especially Syrian region, they've been cooking for over 5,000 years. So they must be perfecting this kind of food. And I share this with many of my friends all the time. They brag about their food, and I say, no, my food, we've been perfecting it for over 5,000 years. No one can beat us. So this is a great background. And so what are some of your favorite recipes that you learned from cooks in Aleppo?
Well, I will also add, before I jump into that question, I'll share a quick story about Aleppan history. Even the name Aleppo is steeped in culinary heritage. So not many people know this, but the name, so Aleppo, if you haven't been there, it's a city that was built around an ancient hill. And so this is an illustration from the 1700s of Aleppo. And you'll see that this city, there's this major hill in the center. And today they have a citadel, a big castle built on top of that hill. And it's believed that Abraham milked a herd of sheep on that very hill and distributed the milk to the poor. And so there's this history of giving in Aleppo as centered around food. And so the Aramaic word for milk is halaba, which is where we get the Arabic name for Aleppo, Halab. And so I love this story because even the name is tied to food. You asked me a question about some of my favorite foods that I learned to make while I was in Syria. And one of them, which I'm still perfecting to this day and I'm still working on and I'm still learning a lot about, is yogurt. And in fact, I will try something. I will show you a peek of what how I learned to make yogurt because I caught it on video. So I'm going to try something new. We weren't expecting this. This is 2009.
الحليب كم كيلو مثلا بدك كيلين 3 تغليه على النار كويس كويس وبعدين تتركه حتى يبرد يصير اصبعتك بتحطها جواته مفتر لل 15 تعدي لل 15 بعدين بتجيب اللبن اللي بتشتريه هي اليوغورت اللي عم تقول عليها من السوق تاخذ معلقتين منها وبتحركها جوات اللبن كويس 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 بعدين بتجيب ترميز المايونيز اللي عندك القديمات ريسايكل ايوه جيب هالطنجرة اللبن وزعها على هالقطرميز كلها وسكر القطرميز ماكن بالغطاء ايوه وشيل هالقطرميز كلهم حطهم بالفرن وجيب قماشه غطيهم هاي المسا تاني نهار الصبح بتفيق تفتح كل قطرميز وقطرميزه شي بياخد العقل
ماشي يفتحوا لازم يحطوه بالبراد مثل ما هو
لا يفتحوا تطمن عليه بعدين على البراد تاخد كل قطرميز تستعمله بتخلصه تكون الباقي ما اخذت من الطنجره وصار محل ما عم تاخد ميات بيطلع مي تبعت الشرب
ومأكول الهنا وخلص
مأكول هنا وبيطلع لبن بياخد العقل
ميرسي كتير. That was how I learned to make yogurt in Aleppo. And so the cool thing about that is that yogurt is an ancient dish. It's believed to have originated in the Middle East. We eat it all the time today, but it has very rich origins. And they make a lot of foods from yogurt. So they strain yogurt and they make lebne, this salted fermented yogurt. They'll turn yogurt into cheese. There's a cheese from the coastal region of Syria called chenklish, which is sort of a blue cheese-like flavor, but made entirely out of yogurt. And so the lady on the video, her name is Leila Dom, and she taught me how to make yogurt in a pot, boil, the milk, and then she explains that you inoculate the milk with the previous yogurt. So you use previous yogurt to make new yogurt. These are the live active cultures, the probiotics that now everybody loves to talk about and enjoys eating. And then what you do is you put it in the jars and then you let it sit in a warm place for about 6 to 8 hours, and then you have yogurt. But I started asking myself, and this is where I like to be nerd out on food, and I'm very curious. I asked myself, well, how did they make yogurt historically? How did they make yogurt hundreds, if not thousands of years ago? And what I learned, that question led me to research clay. Clay before metal was the predominant material for cookware in the world. You would make clay pots. And then I asked myself, well, is there something special about the clay? Or, if they had metal pots, I used to make my yogurt in like a Le Creuset Dutch oven. If they had a Dutch oven, would they have made it in that? Or is there something special about clay? And what I learned is that clay has 2 unique properties. One, it holds the temperature of the food. So while you're making yogurt, you want the milk to stay warm so that the live active cultures could multiply. And better than any material, better than glass, better than metal, better than cast iron, clay really retains the temperature of the contents better than anything else. And then obviously you have to historically think there wasn't refrigeration back then. So when you got something, you wanted to preserve things, clay also keeps things cold. So if you manage to get something cool, it will stay cold for a really long time. And that's why you see a lot of people would keep water in clay jugs in the Middle East. This is obviously, again, before refrigeration. The second special property of yogurt is that of clay is that it's porous. And now because clay is porous, the natural fermentation process of converting milk into yogurt, it releases whey, and the whey is it's liquidy. And so if you buy yogurt from the store, you'll notice that there's this liquid that just sits with the yogurt. With the clay pot will absorb the excess whey, and you end up with a naturally thick and creamy yogurt that's delicious.
Very interesting. And can you explain why it's so healthy, so the viewers understand how healthy yogurt is?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, it all goes down to these like live active cultures, these probiotics. There's a lot of research today, and this is all things that our ancestors intuitively knew, but now science and research is pointing to this symbiotic relationship between humans and microorganisms, the good bacteria, the good microorganisms that live in our gut and that help us digest food. And I'll give you an example. There are some dishes that we are not intended or designed to be able to digest. And a perfect example of that is a soybean. You cannot eat a soybean that's raw. You cannot eat a wheat berry that's raw. Your body cannot break that down. Part of what we do, this sort of pre-processing to wheat, is that we grind it, right? We grind it with a huge stone mill and turn it into powder, what we call flour. But what that does is you'll notice a lot of people have gluten sensitivities because, again, some people and our bodies, our biologies weren't really well equipped to digest this ingredient, flour, that has gluten. And so some people who do not have severe gluten intolerances, like some people who don't have like celiacs, that's on the severe end of the spectrum. But sourdough is based on the same principle, that you have these microorganisms, yeast and bacteria, that work in tandem to break down some of the those ingredients that our bodies cannot process, and their byproducts is stuff that we find nutritious and tasty. And that's why a slow fermentation process is very helpful. Another example is, I mentioned soy. When you ferment soy and you get soy sauce, we could eat soy sauce because that's a fermented product. And the same thing goes with milk. When we ferment milk, some people are lactose intolerant. Well, the byproduct yogurt has less lactose in it. And so some people who, again, are not severely intolerant of milk, they could eat yogurt. And if cow's milk has more lactose in it, but if you are very insensitive, some people go to have goat yogurt, which has less. And that's why some of the hard cheeses, which goes through another type of aging process, allows people with those sensitivities to eat cheese or yogurt. And so that's sort of like, in a nutshell, some of the health benefits to something like yogurt.
That's
wonderful.
Again,
the fascinating thing, and I'll go back to it, I mentioned it before, is our ancestors knew all this.
Yes.
This is, over thousands of years, they figured this out. Yes. And it wasn't, part of what inspires my research is trying to figure out, with modernity, obviously, I don't want to throw out all the advancements in our modern technology. But if you think about it, and I give this example a lot, we've lost a lot, like the social connection as it pertains to cooking. Today, I can grab my phone and I can, with a few swipes, I could have food delivered to my door without needing to speak with a single human. And one of the things that I learned about my research in Syria is that the preparation of food is very social. It's very communal, and Syria is not unique. We see this in a lot of ancient cultures. Yeah. We see this in Italy, people making tortellini. That's a process no one did by themselves. No one would sit down and make tortellini alone in their kitchen. It was a process that people would gather, and there would be a center of a bunch of filling in the center, and you'd make the tortellini. In Puebla, in Mexico, famous for their tamales. Tamales is a festive dish. People didn't make tamales by themselves. And what more and more research is pointing to today is that aside from the physiological benefits to this food, there's also the psychological and social component to the food. We are a social species. We're not meant to live in isolation, as probably many of the viewers can attest to. Being socially isolated at home is very difficult, being alone. And there's fantastic research that shows that industrialized countries are the loneliest. People in industrialized countries are the loneliest we've ever been. And I caveat this by saying that the reasons for this loneliness are very complex. There's a lot of factors. Our societies are a lot more complex than they were. But one component of this is the fact that we're very individualized. Technology has liberated us. We could do so much. We don't need our neighbors anymore. The way we structure our lives, we could do most things by ourselves. But if you look back a few hundred years ago, you relied on your community not just to live, but to survive. Yeah. You needed a baker. You needed your local butcher. You needed your farmers. You needed your local grocers. You needed all these people in your lives. And I just was captivated by this message in Syria. And I don't want to belabor a point, but I'll share one dish that to this day is prepared in a very communal way, even in Syria. And I have it on my slides. I'll describe it before I switch to the slides view. It's called lahme b'ajin. And lahme b'ajin are these very thin meat pies, inspired, the preparation, the way they're made in Aleppo is inspired by the Armenian community. They're paper thin, and people didn't make this by themselves at home. What families did was they made their meat mixture, and then they sent the meat mixture to the baker. The baker already has a lot of dough, so the baker will make a lot of the pies, put the family meat mixture on top, bake it for them. He'll take a few for himself, and then return the rest to the family. So I have a picture of this. These are the meat pies. Share. There we go. Now, I made these in my home in Baltimore. I had to go one by one, opening them and putting the meat mixture on top and baking them. But this is a dish. It was very labor intensive for me, but in Aleppo, it was very easy. In 10 minutes, you mix meat with some parsley, some onions, lots of vegetables, and then you send the meat mixture over. And in the afternoon, you'll get your delivery back with these delicious meat pies.
These are the Syrian meat pies.
Yes, lahme b'ajin.
Delicious. I'm glad I'm not a baker, because I would have kept the majority and gave them only a few to people.
Yeah,
I learned so much as well. It was a great chat.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. This is something I'm very passionate about, and I could get carried away and I'll talk for hours.
Yeah, it really shows through when you talk that you are really interested and happy to talk about this, which makes it even more engaging for the viewers.
And this is a very eye-opening realization that I came to when I was living in Syria. Here in the US, I was actually, I tell this story a lot. I was at a very well-known grocery store that's very beautiful and very nice to be in. And I was buying eggplants. I bought 3 eggplants, and it was somewhere like $9. It was very, I was able to afford it. I was privileged enough to be able to afford this. But then it made me think, someone who's a single mom who's working multiple jobs. The way we structure our food here in the US is just, to me, didn't make much sense. So the cheaper option is to go for fast food, to go for a few burgers from a fast food joint, and you get to feed your family. And the problem with that, though, is that it has a lot of health implications, right? Here, the cheapest, most accessible food is the one that's most harmful. In Syria, it's the reverse. In Syria, there hasn't, fast food hasn't made it there in such a scale that it exists here in the US. So in Syria, the poorest, most vulnerable people in the society had all the access, or relatively easy access, to dark leafy greens, legumes, grains, vegetables. And so to me, that was eye-opening, because it seemed like such an intuitive way. And meat in Syria, very expensive, even for someone, coming with a favorable exchange rate from the West. I had trouble affording meat. And what I realized is that was fine. It made sense. Like when I did have meat, it was very good quality meat. It was from a local butcher. But yeah, I just wanted to make that point, because a lot of times that's a very contentious issue here in the US, how our food system is designed to hurt the most vulnerable in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a subject I have talked about at length in the past. Yeah, it's very, very expensive if you want to eat healthy here. Let me get to more questions that we have.
Middle East, but sometimes I'll post some things on social media. I made cachapas the other day and I posted about it.
What are cachapas?
Cachapas are these corn pancakes. They're very difficult to make.
I'm already sold on it. I want it.
With cheese on top. They're so
that
good.
Sounds like an arepa.
Everything with cheese, I love.
So anyone is in Miami, I haven't lived there for a very long time, but there's a tiny, tiny, tiny restaurant. It's North Bay Village,
okay,
or Normandy Island, right before North Bay Village. There's a tiny restaurant. If you Google on Yelp Venezuelan food, Normandy Island, you'll get the name. It's, I think, a number like 861561. It's one of those trendy names, but they have the best cachapas I've ever had in my life.
Wow, that's actually pretty close to my house. But I was asking you like recommendations on like good restaurants here in South Florida.
I will have to pass on that, just because I haven't lived in, when I go
What
down
about you, Tony?
for Christmas. Yeah, maybe Tony will.
Tony, we need that information. Like, I'm so hungry right now.
The people need to know.
We need to know.
Well, we have to come up with something, but not now.
I guess we can do a Google search, because now I think we and the audience, but especially me and Sophie, now we're really interested. We have to look this up. So let me get to more questions. Okay.
Oh, there's some really good questions.
Yes, there are. What are some valuable cooking techniques you learned on your trip in Syria?
That's a good question.
So techniques, I would say start with the best produce you can. And also, here's the thing, and I try not to get on my soapbox, but like seasonal. Like, I don't know why when I was living in Syria, they had these tomatoes that they called plastic tomatoes. And they were the tomatoes that were grown in greenhouses and available during the winter. They had zero flavor. And the best tomatoes were the ones that were grown in the summer. And so in our globalized food economy, we like to think that we have the right to eat food, any foods we want, any ingredients we want, any time of the year, 24/7, 365 days a year. And the thing is, it has vast environmental repercussions. For you to have a tomato in the winter, it has to come from somewhere, oftentimes not local, and it has to be shipped to you. So I guess, and at the end of the day, it has to be picked for it to last that journey and last on the grocery store shelf for you to buy it. It has to be picked when it's not ripe. It gets gassed in the process. So it gets an artificial ripening process, and then it arrives to your grocery store. And what looks like a tomato by color, shape, and sort of texture has zero flavor. And so a lot of people, I feel I get sad because I wonder how many people eat a tomato in the winter and think, I don't like tomatoes. Well, you haven't had a summer tomato. So I guess in a nutshell, my recommendation is to eat seasonally and to be very picky about where you get your produce. Support your local farmers at the farmers markets.
Great answer. Let's see. You mentioned an ice cream with orange blossom water. Is it Buza ice cream made by Ashta? I am just curious. Yes.
I saw that question. I was excited to answer it. I'm glad you asked it. And I believe Busra joined early, and they mentioned they're from Turkey. So this actually in Turkey, they call this dondurma. Dondurma ice cream. And is it buza? Yeah, it's buza made with, so the ashta is, for those who don't know, ashta is clotted cream. The main ingredient for this, though, is salep in Turkish or sahlab in Arabic. And this is a thickening agent. It's the root, it's the dried, ground up root of an orchid. So there's an orchid called salep in the region. It's endangered now because people it's so rare. So that it's very protected by many governments so that it's not does not go extinct. But yeah, they grab the root of this orchid, they dry it, they grind it into a powder, and they add it to this ice cream, and it gives the ice cream this elastic consistency, almost like taffy. And in Turkey, they call that dondurma.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll get through the rest of these questions. I don't think we're going to take any more than what's already on here because we'll be running. We're already going to be running a few minutes over time because so many people are interested. Let's see.
And if I don't get to your question, feel free to message me on Instagram, and I'm happy to answer.
Let's see. I'm sure you've heard of the omnivore's dilemma. How do you decide what to eat and when to eat it?
That's a fantastic book by Michael Pollan. I have it on my bookshelf behind me somewhere. But yeah, it's eye-opening. How do I decide what to eat? What I mentioned earlier, seasonally and ethically. Michael Pollan also has a great piece on why he decides to eat meat. And I don't judge, obviously, anyone who is vegetarian or vegan. In fact, I will make a plug. Most, at least people who are vegetarian and vegan have thought through the implications of eating animal products. I am sad to say that many people who do eat meat aren't aware of all the implications that are tied to eating meat. So I guess learning about those, like learning about feedlots, learning about the environmental impacts of shipping food around the world has helped me sort of define this philosophy around food. And so I do eat meat, but I try to source all the meat that I buy, for instance, from a local farm. Michael Pollan has a great phrase. These animals are living their creaturely habits. They are out in the fields, not subjected to the horrible conditions in feedlots. But that's a whole other conversation. But that's how I have sort of structured my food philosophy.
Thank you so much. We'll go on to the next question. What specific ingredients do you find yourself gravitating towards when deciding what food to cook?
So I regularly use Aleppo, my spices. Aleppo pepper. I go through jugs of olive oil. My olive oil, I buy it in like 3-liter tanks of olive oil. So Aleppo pepper, za'atar. I recently did on social media, I did a sort of blind taste testing of different types of za'atar, which is a wild blend. It's like a family, it's like oregano, thyme family, but they pick it in the Middle East, they dry it and they mix it with sumac, they mix it with sesame seeds and a little salt, and it's a wonderful seasoning. So those are some of like my go-to, like I constantly, if you're looking to experiment with different grains, I highly recommend a grain called frike. It has a funny name, but it's actually an ancient grain. They grab the wheat berry when it's unripe, the green wheat berry. Jennifer Case loves frike. It's so good. So you grab the wheat berry when it's green, it's unripe, and then how they discovered it, they used to set it on fire, and then they put away the fire, and then that would peel the husk of the wheat berry, and the internal berry itself would have a smoky flavor. And then you cook it the way you would cook rice, and it's, oh my gosh, I wish I could describe how delicious it is. Nutty, smoky, satisfying, rich, creamy. It's delicious.
Sounds amazing.
You could find it at most Mediterranean, Middle Eastern markets.
My former church in Boston area has an annual bazaar making and selling Syrian food. The meat pies traditionally were made with ground lamb, onions, and pine nuts with spices. Is that the standard for locals in Syria now? You made more of an Armenian style, I believe.
Yes. So that's a great question. I should say that there's a general term, lahmi b'ajin, which is the name I used earlier. That means meat on dough, meat dough, or meat on dough. And that's exists around the entire Arab world. In the Levant, there's and that's the sort of variety that use onions, the lamb, the meat, and some pine nuts. This one is an Armenian kind that's paper thin. The dough on the other one is a little thicker. In Lebanon, I believe they call it sfiha, which is the one with the onions and the ground lamb. You asked about lamb versus beef. In the Middle East, lamb is becoming very expensive. Beef is now becoming more common, but it's sort of a process, right? Like the people who want to stick to the tradition. There's a lot of people. Ashel bilbul, exactly. Someone Fernie mentioned is another name for it. Ashel bilbul means literally the nest of a bird, and so like the dish with the dough and the meat sitting in the middle, it looks like a nest. And so the ashel bilbul is the nest of this bilbul, the type of bird. But what I wanted to say about the lamb in Syria, look this up. It's a special variety of lamb called awassi, Awassi. Everyone talks about New Zealand lamb. This tastes a million times better, awassi lamb. It's really good. And it doesn't have a tail. It just has a big ball of fat as a tail. It looks super cute. But what they do is they process that fat and they mix it in when they grind lamb. It adds an immense amount of flavor. And so there's no access to awassi lamb here. So what I do, and it's not as gamey as the New Zealand lamb. So what I do is if I want to recreate the same flavor, I mix half ground lamb, half ground beef in my recipes. And it comes very close to the awassi lamb that I'm used to from Syria.
Oh, wow. That's a really handy tip and sounds pretty easy.
Yeah, especially if you don't like the gaminess of most lamb, cutting it with some beef is helpful.
Perfect. Let me get to our last question. I see that you have plants in the background. Have you ever grown your own food and incorporated it into dishes you've made?
Yes. I live in a small like row home in the city in Baltimore. So I don't have a lot of land to grow, but that is one of my dreams, is to have a larger yard where I can plant more things. But I do herbs. I have like basil, I do tomatoes, thyme, mint. Mint is essential. But one day, one of my dreams, and I didn't talk about this, and this will be another conversation, is to grow mlokhiyeh. Now, everyone in the US talks about kale being, the super green. It sort of it had a hype a few years ago. Mlokhiyeh, Mloukhiyeh, or I don't know why it has a name in English. They call it Jew's mallow. It's a type of mallow, which is a category of plant, but it has an insane amount of nutrients and vitamins, super healthy, and I just wish more people could try it. It's one of my favorite greens, and one of my dreams is to grow mlokhiyeh in my own yard.
Nice.
I'd like to add also, many Middle Eastern families here in the US, when they come in, first thing they look for or to grow in their backyard are grapevines. Not for the grapes, it's for the leaves, so they can make grape leaves meals.
I went with my friends, we went to a local vineyard, and we saw that we asked them, it's an organic research focus is on the middle leaves. And they're like, are you Greek? And we're like, no, why? And they're like, there was a family last week that came asking us the same thing, and they were Greek.
Wow.
And so a lot of the people in the region, Greeks, Turkish, Arabs, we love the grape leaves. My mom, by the way, has her own grapevine, and so she does send, every time I visit, I take with me some grape leaves that are so delicious. They're a lot softer and more tender than the grape leaves that you get in a jar.
Mm-hmm.
What is your Instagram, Antonio, again, so we can post it?
ANTONIO, Tahan, TA, 2 H's, AN, and that's the best way to get in touch with me.
Okay, I just want to say, Antonio, thank you so much for sharing this space with us, and Tony, who has been an incredible collaborator throughout all this process, and who has teach us so much. We have immersed ourselves into Syrian culture through the exhibition, through the music, through the history lessons, film, and now through their food. So it's just incredible. It has been a great experience. We're so grateful and proud to work with both of you guys. So thank you. And I want to say, everyone who tuned in, thank you for joining, for your comments, for your questions.
Yeah, of course. You have been watching Syrian Food Talk with Tony Tahhan, and this was really fun, educational.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tony, Antonio, and Jen. Love you guys.
Hey, I want to encourage our viewers also to, if they can, visit the ArtServe and see the Syrian art exhibition, if they are in South Florida. If not, you can visit artserve.org and review all the wonderful Syrian artwork on the website.
The pieces that you have behind you.